Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Through my work with clients, we're seeing an increasing question come up over time. That as we look forward to 2030, there's some pretty pressing net zero goals that companies have committed to in order to support the trend to decarbonisation across the world. But at the same time, the world right now is not exactly a simple place to operate in. There's ever more increasing pressure on operating margins, questions and uncertainty around where growth is going to come from in the future of companies. And over that time, what we're seeing are more and more companies asking the question of, well, what is the role of data and analytics in helping us square this circle? How can we actually help drive forward our net zero ambitions? And how can we, at the same time, keep an eye on the commercial ambitions as well and make sure that we move forward on both fronts? And so today, we aim to explore that question. What is that role of data and analytics? What are the do's and don'ts? What are the lessons that we've learned so far from this journey? And so I'm thrilled to have this panel join me here. We have representatives across the world of banking, across the world of beauty, and technology. I couldn't think of another B.
Sure.
To talk about the different trends that they're seeing in each. So let me introduce my panelists, and then I'll go through a few questions, and would love to open to the floor in the final 10 minutes or so for any questions that you all have as well. So firstly, we have Ed, who's the VP Group Chief Technology Officer at Natura & Co. So Natura & Co is the group parent to brands that I'm sure many of you will know well. So The Body Shop, Natura, Aesop, and Avon. And it is actually the world's largest B Corp. So this question of sustainability is really key and at the center of the group's thinking and strategy. And Ed's role as CTO means that he's responsible for driving the group data strategy and the engineering practice transformation, and is responsible for the technology elements of the group's sustainability agenda, which uses data and science and analytics to drive a zero carbon footprint and total supply chain traceability by 2030. So that's the first of those big, hairy ambitions for 2030.
Thank you, Louise.
Then we have Dia. So Dia's Global Head of Climate Aligned Finance at HSBC and leads the design and development of capabilities to align HSBC's financed emissions to net zero by 2050. So she shapes sector and portfolio decarbonisation targets for the group and enables their achievement by ensuring data quality, modelling projected outcomes and influencing group strategy. And so those are the insights that really help shape products and portfolio manage across all the business lines and help the bank engage with clients to move them forward on their transition to decarbonisation. And finally, Brad, Director of Business Development for AI and Machine Learning at R2 Factory at Rolls-Royce, and having previously spent his career at Lockheed Martin as well. At R2 Factory, Brad's teams build collaborations with industry verticals to bring the know-how from driving digital transformation at Rolls-Royce to help co-create, AI solutions for the hardest challenges faced by old world industry, and not least, achieving net zero goals. So I hope you agree I have a wonderful panel of perspectives today. So if we dive in then, perhaps to the first question, before we even talk about the analytics side, part of the challenge that I hear my clients talk about is knowing where that carbon actually is to prioritise and start addressing. And not least because a number of sectors don't even have visibility of the end-to-end. It sits either within the suppliers or the customers. Ed, how do you think about that at Natura & Co? How do you start addressing that challenge?
Well, we started initially by following sort of the carbon trust model, which was a series of assumptions made around the products we sell. So you knew the formulation, you knew the location you sold it in, you could make some numbers and come out with a figure that felt reasonable. We've started altering that to now think about what we buy. So instead of us thinking about what we sell and assuming, we got some hard figures about what we buy. So we know what we buy and where we buy it from. Now there's still things to be sorted out around finished goods that we buy or some of our ingredients that come from brokers. But in general, we can make now some pretty hard assumptions of we buy ingredient X like alcohol from plantation or distillery B. So you know some quite targeted stuff around it. And that's a period of progression, but our measurement gets more and more accurate because actually for our accounting purposes, this is something we have to audit because frankly, parts of our bonuses are paid on it and it's part of our integrated profit and loss calculation. So it's now becoming quite the science to, so to say, push procurement to work with suppliers who can give us exact figures.
Wonderful. And Dia, if I look at your world and where the data is, I guess the complication for you is that the question is really about your customers rather than the bank per se in terms of where the carbon sits.
Absolutely. And the transition to net zero could be the largest reallocation of capital in history. According to the IEA, investment in clean tech could reach 4 trillion per annum by 2030. So for us, this is a strategic priority and very central to the bank's ambitions. The bank transitions to net zero if our clients transition to net zero. And it's really important for us to work with our clients in enabling that transition and making sure that we're able to support and empower them so that they're able to thrive in a just transition. To effectively capture that value, we need data and analytics, we need innovation in technology and in finance. And we're starting to pull a narrative together around financed emissions, get a sense for at least an estimated baseline where we don't have reported emissions, and then work through the target setting process. But for us to truly capture value from this proposition, from this journey, we are going to have to work with our clients to understand their transition plans, understand where they are on their journey to net zero through climate disclosure, transparent, consistent, globally consistent with regulatory standards as well. That's quite an important factor that we consider. And the challenge today is that not a lot of this is currently available. And we're trying to work with our clients to encourage this disclosure, but we're also working with peers, industry bodies, regulators, to really sharpen the focus on the need for high quality data that's consistent, comparable, transparent, so we can build out the wide range of analytics use cases that we need to put into play at pace without rewiring the entire enterprise's architecture through the process. So a lot to do. But we're hoping as a first step that transparency in data and that availability moves a lot forward for us.
Fantastic. And I guess in both cases, working with what you have in the first instance and starting moving, if I think of a number of my clients, it could be 2030 before they get perfect data, if that was the pure goal, let alone actually taking the action to address. So I guess prioritizing where you focus in the first instance and chunking through that.
Absolutely. And there are industry methodologies that are doing exactly that. So working through a process of using high quality data where it's available and then estimating or using proxies where there is a little bit of work to do in getting that to a level that's consumable over time.
Yeah. What are what's easy and hard in that journey?
That's a good question. The main challenge is data availability, of course, but there is a challenge around a lot of that data being decentralized, structured and unstructured, housed in legacy systems and architecture, and we need to access that data at pace, at scale, because we're starting to get a portfolio view of a company and feed that into monitoring and decision-making capabilities from bank steering to transaction monitoring. So a whole host of use cases between the two. And to do that, we do need to leapfrog and move forward and make sure we've got the infrastructure in place to start to centralize these data assets and then work through the process of moving from proxy calculations to using real-world data that's as close to the attributable activity that we're trying to measure. So quite a few challenges through that process as well, but a key one is of course, standardization and consistency globally. For a bank like us, that's quite a critical area, and making sure those standards are well adopted and enforced as well.
Fantastic. So, getting the data together, possible but far from easy. I guess, Brad, if we think about then that's just the data asset.
Sure.
What about the analytics that lay on top?
Sure.
What are some of the uses and trends that you're seeing?
Absolutely. We were having a conversation in the prep area in the green corner over there, and what was fascinating about it was we have three very different market verticals, right? We have the beauty, we have banking, and we have aerospace and basically heavy manufacturing, right? Much like automotive or appliances and other areas. And however, we all sort of have the same underlying problem of commonality, which is sort of the ethos of what the R² factory is all about, which is taking all these digital tools and applying them across market verticals in a collaborative way, because the supply chain problems that Ed has are exactly analogous to the supply chain issues that we face in any global extended supply chain for building and manufacturing. The data access from legacy systems and data it's digitized, but it's not accessible to machine learning. So a PDF is a digital document. And we were talking about this before. In fact, we were talking about this about contracts and blockchains in Ethereum. The data that's in those documents needs to be pulled out and interpreted and then reformatted in a way so that there is access to these techniques. So for example, if you're trying to track carbon through your supply chain, a lot of that deep supply chain that's going on in many other countries it's paper-based, or it's certainly not digitally formatted in its first instance. So all that data needs to be converted. And then once we have that data across the supply chain converted, we can start to make predictions and do analytical tools on that. So it's either machine learning or it's predictive analytics to say, given any circumstance in your business environment, it could be weather events, it could be shipping disruptions, it could be political disruptions in certain areas, it could be changes in where the material is sourced from. It can be tracking and assuring that the sourcing that material, it meets your expectations and your guidelines. All of that needs to be collected in digital format, and then we can put various digital analytical techniques against that to make predictions about what's happening in our supply chain. And so at a company like Rolls-Royce, where we deal with titanium and nickel and special metals and things of that nature, there's the first instance of bringing the material in, understanding from the design how much of the material is actually being used to make the final parts. And then you need to start worrying about the circulation, the circular economy around that. So what's happening to the scrap metal? Is it being properly recycled? What's happening at the end of life of the engine? Are you taking the parts and recycling them? And over 90% of that can be recycled. But you have to have a solid understanding of all the data flow in your ecosystem to be able to apply that in an appropriate way.
And I think that's 100% right. And it's also the data isn't necessarily the sort of primary data that's going to give you those useful insights.
Right.
The sort of secondary data from the process. I mean, we make megatons of stuff, and we make billions of unit items across 20 to 50,000 SKUs. The primary things you would think would be the interesting data aren't. It's the secondary things like process efficiencies, like waiting time, it's staged manufacture, it's actually adding intensive areas of weight or carbon usage at different parts of the process gives you wildly different carbon usages. Say, for example, the sort of Coca-Cola problem of shipping syrup versus shipping water. You can add water much later in the process, much closer to the consumer, for a dramatic difference in logistics costs and logistics carbon. And that gives you some really rich data. But to your point, getting access to that data, sometimes it's almost like seeing the wood for the trees. You have to be able to access all of it to run hypotheses against.
So let me put one intersection to what Ed just said, which is really important about the syrup and adding the water. So in physics, F equals ma, and there's no free lunch. I mean, that's pretty much most of physics, which means if you want to move something from one place in the world to another, you're going to have to move the weight of that stuff at a certain speed. Right? And this is where aircraft engines come into place. And now 98% of our carbon emissions are actually in the usage of it, because they burn carbon-based fuels. So if you can figure out a way collaboratively to work with your partners who are using your product, in our case an engine, and in your case makeup and other things, to reduce the amount of weight and reduce the where you add things in a supply chain to put it closer and use less energy, That's low-hanging fruit for us to get together and start to reduce the amount of carbon being spent. The technologies that we need to reduce the amount of carbon used overall, I mean, it's going to be, at least in aircraft engines, it's going to be synthetic fuels, it's going to be new technologies, it's going to be electrification. All those things are important, and they are ongoing now in making great progress. But the low-hanging fruit right now is in the data analytics and the collaboration. This is where we can find places, stop burning the carbon as you're developing the solutions to replace the carbon. And those two things are completely compatible, and I think are critical to addressing the problem.
It's an interesting dilemma we're going to get is organizations where there's a large difference between scope 2 and scope 3.
Right.
They're going to be seeing that. Organizations, my own are relatively close actually, is scope 2 and scope 3 being quite close together. It's a different conversation to have.
Exactly.
And it's certainly, I think also the thing is, it's good business practice. We're not just doing this for altruistic purposes or climate emergency. If we get this right, there are direct bottom line impacts because a carbon-tuned logistics manufacturing sourcing strategy is very often a highly efficient, highly optimized one. And also you've now got all this data around. So you can actually start making commercial decisions as well as just carbon decisions on it.
Right.
And it does help.
And that was one area I wanted to explore and sort of teed up a little in intro, is that if I look at the conversations clients are having, so often people will have a sustainability conversation and then an analytics conversation. And I actually think so often there's a win-win to be had throughout. And, you know, there's a number of cases beginning to sort of prove this out. If I take an example outside of your spaces, but within energy, there's one company, Vistra, recently has talked through about how it applied neural networks algorithms to optimize the energy production of its plants, made massive savings. I think the number was about $60 million. But really importantly, took a 10% swathe out of, as that's rolled out of their net zero targets, just by optimizing what's already there. And that's using technology and so on that's already there in a commercial context, but with a different target variable, effectively, right? Thinking about how can you drive efficiency for carbon's sake. How do you, so Ed, I mean, if you look at, you need that whole network in place, how do you see analytics coming into play, sort of where the opportunities for Natura and Co?
So wave one, as I said, was let's get the data to something we can access it. A lot of it is in legacy. We can move it forward. Was establishing for us essentially was a cadre of data scientists who could work in common ways, be it in sustainability, be it in operational stuff or sort of pricing, promo and assortments. Secondly was actually making some sort of architectural decisions we made our systems, one of which is carbon for us is data. Unless we can measure it, the carbon might as well be just any figure. So it making some pretty fundamental statements that our carbon problem is a data problem. Therefore, let's start with the data first. It's the conversation we were having in the green room is basically, do you have data or are you just making it up? Is a fundamental thing. It gets you away from I feel. It allows a conversation to be had about data, and therefore that provides a level of understanding to our executives that the implications of the analytics can be trusted. Because they understand the data, they understand how the trust is formed. Therefore, there's no sort of immediate emotional reaction to, yeah, well, I don't like your analysis. Well, you like the data. So now the analysis flows logically from that. And that enables us to make some fairly bold decisions. I mean, even fundamental ones of changing the type of alcohol we use. That affects a lot of formulations, but actually has a fundamental difference in our carbon footprint to the tune of a megaton or so. And that's a huge win.
And I think that word that you've just used, decisions, is at the heart of so much of this and is underplayed massively in the conversations in the space, because it is about, there will be trade-offs, right? You will have to make choices about which alcohol to use. I dare say some pretty interesting choices to make about sort of client space and the conversations that you have around financing as well in the banking world.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to my earlier point, it's about integrating a carbon constraint or a lens through all decision making, right? From strategy formation down to looking at transactions and monitoring that they are consistent with our decarbonisation policies, consistent with other parameters and guardrails that we're setting up around client transition, key KPIs that we want to track. And that takes a full transformation of the enterprise. And going back to Ed's point earlier, we've gone through a similar process where we've looked to upskill, bringing in climate and technology experts to sit alongside data, IT, risk, finance, and frontline teams, and really create that cross-functional capability to really bring in a structured, consistent, data-driven decision-making framework that we can apply and continues to drive that transition and execution of that strategy in a way that truly generates value and delivers the best for our customers. And there will be trade-offs, there will be choices, but there are going to be huge opportunities, and that's where we really want to be there for our clients. And if they're able to tell us where they are in their journey, it makes it a lot easier to add that support from a financial perspective and really start to develop solutions that help them get there as well.
I think that's a really important point, Diane. I mean, I got a lot of buy-in internally from our programs by spotting a couple of sort of counterintuitive results, which had financial upside as well. So, as I mentioned, changing alcohol. The alcohol that we're going to is less dense. So there are lower shipping costs and the formulations can change. So that sort of counterintuitive result that the analytics showed up actually grabbed a lot of attention, and that made the decision buy-ins a lot easier. So therefore the climate experts, the advocates now have a greater platform to influence decisions on, because their data is backed and they've got some results that they can point to that help the business, not just sort of sounded
Instinct.
a bit. Yeah.
I mean, I'm taking away that data engineers and architects are going to be the unsung hero of decarbonisation, which is amazing. And also just the importance of bedding into the processes, right? The day-to-day decision-making and ensuring that the trade-offs are transparent and clear. And then finally, collaboration, I guess, was your point, Brad, of how do you, well, and Ed also, right? How do you actually think about different parts of the supply chain coming together? And sharing, I guess, in the first instance, but...
Yeah, for sure. I think we talk about how complicated things are, and it's true. These are very complex problems with lots of noise in the system, and sometimes it's very difficult to make predictions. But when you get more of the right data in your supply chain, you start to narrow the uncertainties and you can make better predictions. And then to your point earlier about making decisions, either you or Ed said, the challenges in making decisions. One of the things that we can do through collaboration and through these tools is create the kind of decision-making tools that executives can make to design their systems to be better. Right? These are, the whole system is man-made. Right? We have designed and engineered and built everything in the built world. The solution is also under our control as well. We just need to put in the processes and the right kinds of, priorities to make sure that we're understanding what's happening through that supply chain, to make sure that we're making those right decisions. Right now, I think we're at the front end of where many businesses were maybe 5 or 6 years ago, Rolls-Royce included, where we looked across our business when we were the R-Squared data labs internally and said, if we can bring all this data together, if we can put some tools on the table that can interpret engineering drawings that were on paper or in pre-digital systems the way we understand them today, we can better understand how to make our decisions today, right? And jet engines are very complicated things with very complicated supply chains, and they are very safety critical devices that we rely on every day to move people and goods around the world. That same ethos, that same kind of understanding of that is exactly what we took away from those lessons learned to apply to build the R-Squared factory, which is the intention to spread that around other market verticals. So it's the nearly £500 million of cost savings and cost avoidance, which economically right there pays for itself many times over. But now layer on top of that the impact that we can have by applying these things globally to climate change, to reductions of, buying oil from bad actors in the world, and all the things that the benefits that come with it come through the data stream and understanding where things are in the system. Only then can we really apply the tools. Without the data, without the understanding, the tools are guessing.
And I think, Brad, you've got a point there as well, because we're seeing that collaboration is, we have to go into our supply chain to help our supply chain provide data, because some of these organizations we work with are not data savvy. So it's like the sort of Six Sigma lean type thing. It's a form of lean carbon supply chain. I'm going to have to help my supply chain tell me about the stuff they send me. and how they themselves could benefit from this. So it's, because that benefits me, I'm going to have to almost do it with them or even occasionally to them to get them to do it, because I can't swap and change suppliers that easily sometimes. I have to work with them.
And I imagine that your suppliers range quite dramatically in terms of the scale of company that you're talking about.
It's huge.
Where they are, the sophistication of their own processes.
And some of them, it might sound ridiculous, and in the grand scheme of things, possibly a small impact. But some of our suppliers are almost medieval companies that have been sole suppliers of certain spices or things. They don't think in a data world, but their impact is cumulative. A ton saved here, a ton saves there, starts adding up. If we can help them save, or just tell us about, well, this is how much carbon you're using.
I'm going to ask you to suspend belief for a second. So the data is now there.
Sure.
What then is the next step? What are the analytics that you would start running over the top that will make the difference? I gave an example of one specific piece of the chain and saying you can optimize and use data and analytics for both commercial and carbon gains. What are the other areas that you think, perhaps Brad, Ed, what areas would you see?
So you're envisioning a world where I have complete data transparency across my entire
good enough.
ecosystem.
I'm going to go with good enough rather than
good
complete.
Enough data. Fair enough. I think at this point, it's where you are looking at building a model of your system, right? The same way you build a bridge, the same way you build a jet engine, the same way you build an international space station. You have to really understand how the system itself operates and how the pieces work together. And sometimes that's not necessarily a very straightforward interaction. Sometimes it's what we call chaotic, right? Things can happen that are very small changes here that can have big changes over here. And I think a big part of what we'll be doing is building these multiple models that can predict multiple scenarios so that as we watch the environment evolve, it's like, imagine you're trying to predict the weather in London.
Good grief.
Right? Now, maybe 100 years ago, you got a telegraph from Manchester that said it's raining. And then you got a telegraph from somewhere between said it's raining, and it was an hour later. So you can say, okay, it's moving this fast and that far away, I can kind of predict. So that's one way of predicting. Prior to that information, you basically looked at the horizon, and when the dark clouds came, you could say it might rain, it still might rain. Who knows, for sure. So there's this idea that the further out in time you can look, and then understand the direction of travel of the various parameters inside of your ecosystem, which is in your model, allows you to better make a good decision and make a good prediction, right? And now when you do an optimization, you have to be very careful, and this is part of what we do in our data ethics with our Alethea framework, is to make sure that when we make those predictions and put what we call a reward function, it's like, what do we want the model to tell us? Is it optimizing for the best reduction of carbon, the speed of motion of goods, whatever that may be? We have to assure that that reward function that the model is giving us information on aligns to our values and to the actual goals that we're looking for. Right? We don't want to find that we've created an additional set of externalities by eliminating another set, right? So the ethical piece in the data frameworks is actually a critical part of what we integrate, starting first with Rolls-Royce, and now it's an integral part of the platform that is the R² factory.
And I think, Brad, just to extend it, I mean, this might sound ridiculous, was actually getting our analytics guys to move away from working on tests, essentially. Here is a scenario executives have come up with, what will it do? To actually building models that can inform decisions rather than testing the outcome. And that's been a huge thing of just actually working with Louise's team, was to map our data to the value chain and go, actually, well, no, this is telling us something really important here, but you guys never do that apart from a test. Let's build a model. Let's run it 1 trillion times and see, is this chaotic, stable? If it's stable, can we rely on the predictions? And if we can rely on the predictions, what are we going to do about them? And that's a mind shift across our executives, across our entire organization, was you can actually do analytics, not just testing. You can simulate, you can predict.
So in the real world, to gently attack the predicate of your question, which was, I have the data. We don't have the data.
No.
We do have observations of how the system works, and it's in these cases where we can synthesize some data. So we don't necessarily have the exact data that's coming in from a measurement, but we know how the system performs. And by doing that, you can synthesize a data set from which you can make an assumption and train your models in areas where you don't know what's happening. And it's empirical. So you run your model, you do a million different runs, and you find out which one's fitting the trend at the time, and that's the ones that allow you to fill in the gaps. So some of the data is hidden. It's in our documents, it's in other companies. Some of it is not collected, which is something we can solve by putting technology out into the field. And some of it needs to be synthesized because it's either not available through either method, or we have to sort of figure out how to fill in the gaps. But all these things can be done in a quantitative way that helps us reduce the risk and improve our decision making to create those good optimal ethical outcomes that we're looking for.
And I hear you about the limitations. I agree. But I think the really interesting piece is this move from, there's the use cases within the company, but then what is that end-to-end system view that you can start building out? You know, modeling your data assets so that you can start putting together the full sort of supply chain and understanding the what-ifs. Right. And again, it all comes back to the point earlier of what are the choices that you have to make, and having as robust a fact base as is available at the time with the limitations in place to actually make good calls given the time horizons that we're looking at.
And I think because the transition and that value migration is going to create network effects that we need to really start to crystallize early. And we need to understand where we're seeing growth and cash flows moving into certain sectors, and really make decisions around investment opportunity, and where we want to try and manage our assets more effectively from a risk perspective. And I think that applies not just to the banking sector, but as you work through the corporate supply chain, you're looking at similar themes coming through, and being able to truly pull together a large volume of data that's relatively consistent from across the economy is going to shape that economy-wide transition. And without that, it's going to be a pretty challenging process in trying to build comparability and transparency through it all.
Great. So I'm conscious of time. Before I open to the floor, I have one last question for each of you, which is, if you look at the people in the audience now, anyone thinking about their companies approaching this sustainability shift that they need to make within their own companies and thinking about how to use data and analytics in that journey, what would be the one piece of advice that you would offer based on your experiences so far? Dear, if I maybe start with you.
And maybe just continuing with the same theme I was touching on, building out that infrastructure in terms of data interoperability and the architecture to support it all and enable that flow of information through the wider ecosystem is absolutely critical. And I think regulators, industry bodies, credible industry bodies have a leadership role to play here. And there's a huge opportunity to come together and start shaping these standards. And by opening up that non-competitive data layer, it creates huge innovation. And we've seen that in other sectors like banking and payments, for example. And the opportunity to really start to build analytics and applications as well. So for me, that's a key point.
Fantastic. Ed, words of advice?
I'm going to echo this. I mean, without the data, you haven't got the carbon story. So get the data together as soon as you can. Be really clear about your assumptions, where you're synthesizing data, where you can't get it, and work with either regulators where they exist or industry-wide bodies to get agreed approaches that everybody can test and look at, because in the end of it, the only regulator we're really going to face here is the atmosphere, and that doesn't really sort of allow us a huge amount of regulatory flex. We've got to be real about this one. This isn't a market that we can create additional stuff in or trade too easily. So it's going to be stuff like get the data together, focus on the architecture and open standards, and be clear about assumptions.
Fantastic.
Yeah. To augment what was said by my colleagues on the stage here, I think get going. The time is now. I mean, I don't think hesitating or waiting for some miracle to happen on your own is going to do it. And it's a team sport. I mean, we must work on this together because it's a global problem that requires a global solution and global thinking. We knew it when we just integrated all this data and all these techniques across three of the main business areas at Rolls-Royce and cut 200 million pounds procurement costs, created 45 million pounds of value in predictive analytics in terms of supply chain management, and I could go on and on. I mean, these are real hard numbers that are in the books inside Rolls-Royce that we're measured on. That can be, imagine if we now worked across our verticals, which are huge, banking and beauty and aerospace. These are really giant impacts on the world. If we work together, then those numbers just had more and more zeros on the end of them, and it's just orders of magnitude greater impact. And I think get started, work together, and don't hesitate. Just go for it.
That's a perfect note to turn to the audience. Thank you. Does anyone have any question for our panelists at all? We go start at the front, then we'll go back after.
Hi, I'm David. I'm curious to know, like, I think I researched working at Rolls-Royce, and I think you have to have like a PhD to work. Am I correct? And if that's not, if that, most companies do. What do you think most companies can do to lower the barrier to entry into like data analytics or data engineering?
Sure, I guess that's to me to start with anyway. Thank you for your question. No, you don't need a PhD to work at Rolls-Royce. There are thousands of engineers across the whole skill set. So I would encourage you, if you're interested, to just go to the website, look for jobs. You can see me afterwards. We can talk about it. I think, I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Moving into data engineering.
Oh, lower the barriers. Yeah, in terms of one of the things that we have inside Rolls-Royce is what we call a gig, right? And so people in engineering or in other skill centers can take part-time assignments to work with, say, our team in data analytics, right, in machine learning. And it's not like a secondment where they're like permanently assigned. It's just a short-term, pick a project, get on there, get upskilling, learn what we do, and then take those skills back into their own area. So there's a company, and there's also a very large inside Rolls-Royce cultural program where we've trained over 30,000 of our team around agile thinking and human-centered design. All those things are happening around inside the company. So once you're in, you're certainly not locked into a stovepipe. There are opportunities for you to build your skills around this. And I think senior leadership is seriously recognizing how important it is that people understand not just the fact that there's these tools out there, but how the tools can be applied in their area, which is key to sort of overcome that misunderstanding about expectations of what they can do.
And I'll echo that, Brad. I mean, in Natura, we have a need for hundreds of data scientists in the very near future, and I can't afford, essentially, to buy them from outside. I have to create my own data scientists. Our concept is called citizen data scientists, to sort of extend the citizen developer model. We have various sources of entry point. We work very closely with universities. We don't need PhDs in this area. And we try and encourage training at every level to understand the basics of data, understand simple analytics, understand how to consume the outputs of it, but also how to create new ones. And for our hardcore data scientists, how do we support and develop that talent from inside and outside?
Yeah.
I love the point, by the way, about the broader training of the organisation, because actually it's one thing we touched on briefly with our sustainability conversation, but so much, I think, is around senior executives also understanding the data challenges, 100%. The role of analytics in making these decisions, and sort of educating them along the way as well.
That's a big, actually, we're finding when we work with other companies now, as we've stood up the R² factory, is that we're finding that that's a piece that they value from us quite a bit, which is that cultural transformation, that shift in understanding at the leadership level, that they need to continually look at these techniques and look at how they're going to be applied and keep up with it. It's not a one-off. No. It's a constant learning process. It's a constant training process. And I think it's really being recognized board level down.
Absolutely.
I think this is becoming ingrained in the culture of businesses. And quite frankly, that's the toolkit that's going to help us get to where we need to be.
Totally agree. Wonderful question. Oh, so many more. There was a question back here. I promised to go to you next. The lady in the red further back. Sorry.
Hi, Ulrika Weising, SVP Energy Transition at Valorec. We're an iron and steel company, and we supply, to thousands of customers across the globe. We're a very data-savvy company, and we follow the Science-Based Target Initiative for our carbon estimates as well as our ambitions. One of the challenges that we're faced by our customers is that every single customer has their own systems there where they request our carbon footprint, our carbon emission per product, etc. And is there any initiatives that you see to kind of standardize this? Because also every customer has a different kind of baseline or way of calculating and estimating it. And it is very, very cumbersome, and it's just getting more and more cumbersome for companies like us to actually provide the data to our supply chain. Mm-hmm. Do you see any initiatives to standardize this? And please share.
So I can take one actually.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
We've got about 30,000 plus suppliers. It's kind of a top-down model. There are some trans-industry ones. We're part of something called Eco Beauty Score, which is a way for us to tell consumers about the carbon impacts of the products. And we're working with our supply chain and people like SAP and some of our main suppliers to standardize at least the data formatting, ignoring how we calculate it, but at a basic level, can we all agree how we tell each other about the data? Mm-hmm. So is it a big form, a little form? Is it in XML? What standard are we going to use? So it's early days. I think it's being led initially by consumer communication. We have to tell our consumers about the carbon impacts of their products, and that's publicly known now. But the next stage is working with our major suppliers of technology to come up with some not yet international standards, but best practices that at least we can talk about, and then make some easy comparisons between the two. But there isn't yet a sort of banking to beauty to aeronautics and heavy engineering standard across the piece yet. If there was, I suspect it'd be somebody like SAP or Microsoft or IBM or Oracle or Google or Amazon will help develop that standard, because it's in their best interest to make that integration easier.
Fantastic. Other questions? If we come down the front here. Sorry to make you run.
Hi, my name is Mehrooz, and thank you, Ed, Brad, Thea, and Louise for a great session. It was really useful to get an insight about how data and analytics can be used to make much more informed decisions, especially in the beauty sector and across the other sectors like finance and engineering. I really want to understand what unexpected failures might occur in future, few years down the line, when everyone is using AI, data analytics, what failures might occur on an industry or on a corporate world that is heavily reliant on the data and AI? In terms of predictions, in terms of measurement, what failures might occur that can impact, and are we ready for it? I know we're not yet ready for AI, but once it's implemented, are we ready for its failures as well?
I think I can give you a stab. It's on our risk register. There's two basically. One is ethical. Some of our stuff isn't ethical, therefore that's a long-term impact. We discover that there's a hidden consequence of doing something that isn't very good. And the second one, as I mentioned earlier on, and with Dai, the assumptions. Where am I assuming or synthesizing data? If I get that wrong, that can lead to some significant downstream impacts that you won't see until they crystallize. So to my mind, it's ethics and assumptions are where the failures are going to come from. And that could manifest in various things as pricing goes wrong, profit disappears, or actually suddenly we start producing more carbon than we thought we were.
Go ahead.
I also think as we work through this challenge at pace, I think the opportunity to test, retest, and really hone in or nail down a hypothesis perhaps just isn't available, and often you end up making decisions using imperfect data, imperfect models, and as you're making trade-offs, you add another layer of complexity where you're looking at a range of decisions and trying to crystallize the right outcome there. So there are going to be, I think, some negative impacts, but I think the best we can do is work with what we have at the time, effectively manage to build consistency and resilience across the piece. But I do think that given the pace we're working at, that is a potential challenge.
Yeah. And I think as well, just building on some of the themes from earlier, that there's two important pieces that you all elaborated on. One is fully systems thinking. Is some of the danger, I think, is sort of point solutions and thinking in isolation without the sort of up and downstream impacts really being worked through. And then a bit to your point on assumptions, Ed, is about having transparency and explainability. So why, when you're simulating, is X the right outcome? What's actually driving that underneath? Does that make sense? Actually putting the human sort of intuition over the top rather than, blindly following where the black box says do X.
Yeah.
I think I would just add to that one of the reasons that the Aletheia framework is such a powerful part of our own ethos is that we're building it in at the front end.
Yeah.
Right? We're not waiting to see what negative externalities we've created by applying machine learning. We actually have a process that says, is your data correct? Is it built in a way that you've done it the best you can to eliminate biases? Is it going to provide you with the answer that you're looking for? Are your processes and the way that you're using the AI consistent with your expectations and your outcomes and your own ethical frameworks that your company is built on? Building that in at front end is critical, because once you deploy and you're making money and then discover later that, I have a problem because I've built a business model on an unethical use of data, it's hard to unwind that clock. So we believe putting that in at the front end, understanding it at the beginning and challenging ourselves as we go forward consistently over and over again is really the only path forward to make sure that you avoid these potential hiccups from using AI and machine learning. It's a powerful tool that needs to be managed carefully.
So the right question, and the right question for right now. Perfect. We are out of time, I'm afraid. I know there were a bunch more questions, but thank you so much for the brilliant conversation. Thank you so much to my panelists for all of their insights.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.